Chapter 4. Startled by the faint rustle of a skirt swishing past me, I opened my eyes and gazed at the candle burning on the altar in the semi-darkness of the room. The flame flickered and sent up a single black thread of smoke. On the wall appeared a woman's shadow with a stick in its hand. The shadow seemed to impale the heads of the men and women who, with closed eyes, were sitting beside me on old wooden chairs arranged in a circle. I could barely stifle a nervous giggle upon realizing that it was Mercedes Peralta, placing big, hand-rolled cigars in everyone's mouth. She then took the candle from the altar, lit each cigar with it, and returned to her chair in the middle of the circle. In a deep, monotonous voice, she began to chant an unintelligible, repetitious incantation. Suppressing a fit of coughing, I tried to synchronize my smoking with the rapid puffing of the people around me. Through teary eyes, I watched their solemn, mask-like faces become momentarily animated with every puff until they seemed to dissolve in the thickening smoke. Like a disembodied object, Mercedes Peralta's hand materialized out of that vaporous haze. Snapping her fingers, she repeatedly traced the air with the imaginary lines connecting the four cardinal points. Imitating the others, I began to sway my head to and fro to the rhythmic sound of her snapping fingers and her low-voiced incantations. Ignoring my growing nausea, I forced myself to keep my eyes open so as not to miss a single detail of what was occurring around me. This was the first time I had been allowed to attend a meeting of spiritualists. Doña Mercedes was going to serve as the medium and contact the spirits. Her own definition of spiritualists, witches, and healers was the same as Florinda's, with the exception that she recognized another independent class, mediums. She defined mediums as the interpreting intermediaries who serve as conduits for the spirits to express themselves. She understood that mediums were so independent that they did not have to belong to any of the three other categories. But they could also be all four categories in one. There is a disturbing force in the room. A man's voice interrupted Doña Mercedes' incantations. Smoldering cigars perforated the smoky darkness like accusing eyes as the rest of the group mumbled their agreement. "I'll see to it," she said, rising from her chair. She went from person to person, pausing for an instant behind each one. I yelled out in pain as I felt something sharp piercing my shoulder. "Come with me," she whispered into my ear. "You aren't in a trance." Afraid I would resist, she took me firmly by the arm and led me to the red curtain that served as a door. "But you yourself asked me to come," I insisted before I was pushed out of the room. "I won't bother anyone if I sit quietly in a corner." "You'll bother the spirits," she murmured, and noiselessly drew the curtain shut. I walked to the kitchen at the back of the house, where I usually worked at night, transcribing tapes and organizing my gradually growing field notes. Swarms of insects clustered around the single bulb dangling from the kitchen ceiling. Its weak light illuminated the wooden table standing in the middle of the room. but left the corners in shadows where the flea-ridden mangy dogs slept. One side of the rectangular kitchen was open to the yard. Against the other three walls, blackened by soot, stood a raised adobe cooking pit, a kerosene stove, and a round metal tub filled with water. I walked into the moonlit yard. The cement slab where Doña Mercedes' companion, Candelaria, spread out well-soaped clothes to whiten in the sun each day shone like a silvery puddle of water. The wash hanging on the lines looked like white stains against the darkness of the stucco wall encircling the yard. Outlined by the moon, fruit trees, medicinal plants, and vegetable patches formed a uniform dark mass, humming with insects and the strident call of crickets. I returned to the kitchen and checked the pot simmering on the stove. No matter what time of day or night, there was always something to eat. Usually, it was a hearty soup made of meat, chicken, or fish, depending on what was available, and an assortment of vegetables and roots. I searched for a soup plate among the dishes piled on the wide adobe shelves built into the wall. There were dozens of unmatched china, metal, and plastic plates. I served myself a large bowl of chicken soup. But before sitting down, I remembered to scoop out some water from the nearby tub and replenish the pot on the stove. It had not taken me long to familiarize myself with the habits of that eccentric household. I started to write down what had transpired in the meeting. Trying to recollect every detail of an event or every word of a conversation was always the best exercise to fight off the sense of loneliness that invariably came upon me. The cold nose of a dog rubbed against my leg. I searched for leftover pieces of bread, fed them to the dog, and then returned to my notes. I worked until I felt sleepy and my eyes burned, strained by the weak light. I collected my tape recorder and papers, then headed down toward my room, situated at the other end of the house. I paused for an instant in the inside patio. It was patched with moonlight. A faint breeze stirred the leaves of the gnarled grapevine. Its jagged shadows painted lacy patterns on the brick courtyard. Before actually seeing the woman, I felt her presence. She was squatting on the ground, almost hidden by the large terracotta pots scattered throughout the patio. A woolly mop of hair crowned her head like a white halo, but her dark face remained indistinct, blending in with the shadows around her. I had never seen her in the house before. I recovered from my initial fright by reasoning that she must be one of Doña Mercedes' friends, or perhaps one of her patients, or even one of Candelaria's relatives who was waiting for her to come out of the seance. "Pardon me," I said. "I'm new here. I work with Doña Mercedes." The woman nodded as I spoke. She gave me the impression she knew what I was talking about, but she did not break her silence. Possessed by an inexplicable uneasiness, I tried not to succumb to hysterical fright. I kept repeating to myself that I had no reason to panic, because an old woman was squatting in the patio. "Were you at the seance?" I asked in an uncertain voice. The woman shook her head affirmatively. "I was there too," I said, "but Doña Mercedes kicked me out." I felt relieved all of a sudden and wanted to make fun of the situation. "Are you afraid of me?" the old woman asked abruptly. Her voice had a cutting, raspy, yet youthful sound. I laughed. I was about to say no with a flippant air when something held me back. I heard myself saying that I was terrified of her. "Come with me," the woman ordered me, matter-of-factly. Against my first reaction, my first reaction was to follow her boldly. But instead, I heard myself saying something I had not intended. "I have to finish my work. If you care to talk to me, you can do it here and now." "I command you to come," the woman's voice boomed. All the energy of my body seemed to drain out of me at once. Yet I stated, "Why don't you command yourself to stay?" I could not believe I had said that. I was ready to apologize when a strange reserve of energy flowed into my body and made me feel almost under control. "Have it your way," the woman said, and stood up from her squatting position. Her height was inconceivable. She grew and grew until her knees were at my eye level. At that point, I felt my energy leaving me, and I let out a series of wild, piercing screams. Candelaria came rushing to my side. She covered the distance between the room where the meeting of spiritualists was taking place and the patio before I had time to gasp for air and scream once more. "Everything is all right now," she repeated in a soothing voice that seemed to come from far away. Gently, she rubbed my neck and back, but I could not stop from shaking. And then, without wanting to, I began to cry. "I shouldn't have left you by yourself," she said apologetically. "But who would have thought a Musuya would see her?" Before any of the other participants in the meeting came out to see what was going on, Candelaria took me to the kitchen. She helped me into a chair and gave me a glass of rum. I drank it and told her what had happened in the patio. The instant I had finished both the rum and my account, I felt drowsy, distracted, but far from drunk. "Leave us alone, Candelaria," Doña Mercedes said, stepping into my room. Not only had Candelaria put me to bed, she had also placed a cot alongside so that she could be there when I awoke. "I don't know how to say this," Doña Mercedes began after a long silence, "but you're a medium. I knew this all along." Her feverish eyes seemed to be suspended in a crystalline substance as she studied my face intently. "The only reason they did let you sit in the seance was because you're lucky. Mediums are lucky." In spite of my apprehension, I had to laugh. "Don't laugh about this," she admonished. "It's serious. In the patio, you called a spirit all by yourself. And the most important spirit of them all, the spirit of one of my ancestors, came to you. She doesn't come often, but when she does, it's for important reasons." "Was she a ghost?" I asked stupidly. Of course she was a ghost, she said firmly. We understand things the way we've been taught. There are no deviations from that. Our beliefs are that you saw a most frightening spirit and that a live medium can communicate with the spirit of a dead medium. Why would the spirit come to me? I asked. I don't know. She came to me once to warn me, she replied. But I didn't follow her advice. Her eyes became gentle, and her voice grew softer as she added, the first thing I told you when you arrived was that you're lucky. I was lucky too, until someone broke my luck. You remind me of that person. He was as blonde as you are. His name was Federico, and he also had luck, but he had no strength whatsoever. The spirit told me to leave him alone. I didn't, and I'm still paying for it. At a loss as to how to take the sudden turn of events or the sadness that had come upon her, I placed my hand over hers. He had no strength whatsoever, she repeated. The spirit knew it. Although Mercedes Peralta was always willing to discuss anything pertaining to her practices, she had quite emphatically discouraged my curiosity regarding her past. Once, and I don't know whether I caught her unaware or whether it was a deliberate move on her part, she revealed that she had suffered a great loss many years ago. Before I had a chance to decide whether she was actually encouraging me to ask personal questions, she lifted my hand to her face and held it against her cheek. Feel these scars, she whispered. What happened to you? I asked, running my fingers over the rough scar tissue on her cheeks and neck. Until I touched them, the scars had been indistinguishable from the wrinkles. Her dark skin felt so brittle, I was afraid it would disintegrate in my hand. A mysterious vibration emanated from her entire body. I could not shift my gaze from her eyes. We won't talk about what you saw on the patio, she said emphatically. Things like that pertain only to the world of mediums, and you should never discuss that world with anyone. I would certainly advise you not to be afraid of that spirit, but do not beckon her foolishly. She helped me get out of my bed and led me outside to the same spot in the patio where I had seen the woman. As I stood there inspecting the darkness around us, I realized that I had no idea whether I had slept a few hours or an entire night and day. Doña Mercedes seemed to be aware of my confusion. It's 4 a.m, she said. You've slept almost 5 hours. She crouched where the woman had been. I squatted beside her, between the shrubs of jasmine hanging down from wooden lattices like perfumed curtains. It never occurred to me that you didn't know how to smoke, she said and laughed, her dry, raspy laughter. She reached inside her skirt pocket, pulled out a cigar, and lit it. At a meeting of spiritualists, we smoke hand-rolled cigars. Spiritualists know that the smell of tobacco pleases the spirits. After a short pause, she put the lit cigarette in my mouth. Try to smoke, she ordered. I drew on it, inhaling deeply. The heavy smoke made me cough. Don't inhale, she said impatiently. Let me show you how. She reached for the cigar and puffed at it repeatedly, breathing in and out in short, even spurts. You don't want the smoke to go to your lungs, but to your head, she explained. That's the way a medium calls the spirits. From now on, you're going to call the spirits from this spot. And don't talk about it until you can conduct a spiritualist meeting all by yourself. But I don't want to call the spirits, I laughingly protested. All I want is to sit in one of the meetings and watch. She regarded me with a threatening determination. You are a medium, and no medium goes to a meeting to watch. What is the reason for a meeting? I asked, changing the subject. To ask questions of the spirits, she promptly responded. Some spirits give great advice. Others are malevolent. She chuckled with a touch of malice. Which spirits show up depends on the medium's state of being. Are mediums then at the mercy of the spirits? I asked. She was silent for a long time, looking at me without betraying any feelings in her face. Then, in a defiant tone, she said, "They are not if they are strong." She continued staring at me fiercely. Then she closed her eyes. When she opened them again, they were devoid of all expression. "Help me to my room," she murmured. Holding on to my head, she straightened up. Her hand slid down my shoulder, then to my arm, the stiff fingers curling around my wrist like carbonized roots. Silently, we shuffled down the dark corridor, where wooden benches and chairs, covered with goat hide, stood rigidly against the wall. She stepped inside her bedroom. Before closing the door, she reminded me again that mediums do not talk about their world. I knew the instant I saw you in the plaza that you were a medium and that you would be coming to see me, she affirmed. A smile, the meaning of which I did not understand, crossed her face. You have come to bring me something from my past. What? I don't quite know myself. Memories, perhaps, she said vaguely. Or perhaps you are bringing my old luck back. She brushed my cheek with the back of her hand and softly closed the door. Chapter 5. Lulled by the soft breeze and the laughter of children playing in the street, I dozed all afternoon in the hammock that hung between two sorsop trees in the yard. I was even oblivious to the scent of powdered detergent mingled with the pungent odor of creosol with which Candelaria washed the floors twice each day, regardless of whether they were dirty. I waited until it was nearly 6 o'clock. Then, as Mercedes Peralta had requested, I went and knocked on her bedroom door. There was no answer. Quietly, I stepped inside. Usually at that time, she was through with the people who came to her to be treated for one malady or another. She never saw more than 2 a day. On her bad days, which were quite frequent, she saw no one. On those occasions, I took her for rides in my Jeep and for long walks in the surrounding hills. "Is that you, Musuya?" Doña Mercedes asked, stretching in her long hanging hammock, fastened to metal rings built into the wall. I greeted her and sat on the double bed by the window. She never slept in it. She maintained that from a bed, regardless of its size, one could have a fatal fall. Waiting for her to get up, I looked around the oddly furnished room that never failed to enchant me. Things had been arranged there with a look of purposeful incongruity. The two night tables at the head and foot of the bed, cluttered with candles and figurines of saints, served as altars. A low wooden wardrobe, painted blue and pink, blocked the door that opened to the street. I wondered what was inside. For Doña Mercedes' clothes, she never wore anything but black. Hung everywhere, from hooks on the walls and behind the door, at the head and foot of the iron bedstead, and even from the ropes holding the hammock. A crystal chandelier, which did not work, dangled precariously from the cane ceiling. It was gray with dust, and spiders had spun their webs around its prisms. An almanac, the kind one tears a page from each day, hung behind the door. Combing her fingers through her white mop of hair, Mercedes Peralta heaved a deep sigh, then swung her legs out of the hammock and hunted about with her feet for her cloth sandals. She sat still for a moment, then moved to the high, narrow window facing the street and opened its wooden panels. She blinked repeatedly until her eyes adjusted to the late afternoon light beaming into the room. Intently, she gazed at the sky, as if she were expecting some message from the sunset. "Are we going for a walk?" I asked. Slowly, she turned around. "A walk?" she repeated, arching her brows in surprise. "How can we go for a walk when I have a person waiting for me?" I opened my mouth, ready to inform her there was no one outside. But the mocking expression in her tired eyes compelled me to silence. She took my hand, and we walked out of her room. With his chin buried in his chest, a frail-looking old man dozed on the wooden bench outside the room, where Mercedes Peralta treated people who came for help. Sensing our presence, he straightened up. "I don't feel too well," he said in a toneless voice. Reaching for his straw hat and the walking stick lying beside him. "Octavio Cantu," Mercedes Peralta said, addressing herself to me, but shaking his hand. She led him up the 2 steps into the room. I followed close behind. He turned around with an inquiring expression in his eyes as he gazed at me. "She's been helping me," she said. "But if you don't want her with us, she'll go outside." He stood there for a moment, nervously shifting his feet. His mouth twisted into a lopsided smile. "If she has been helping you," he murmured with a touch of helplessness, "I suppose it's all right." With a swift movement of her head, Mercedes Peralta motioned me to my stool by the altar, then helped the old man into the chair directly in front of the high rectangular table. She seated herself to his right, facing him. "Where could it be?" she mumbled repeatedly, searching among the assortment of jars, candles and cigars, dried roots, and scraps of material scattered on the table. She sighed with relief upon finding her nautical compass, which she placed in front of Octavio Cantu. Attentively, she studied the round-shaped metal box. "Look at this," she cried out, beckoning me to move closer. It was the same compass I had seen her examine so intently the first day I walked into that room. The needle, barely visible through the opaque, badly scratched glass, moved vigorously to and fro, as if animated by some invisible force emanating from Octavio Cantu. Mercedes Peralta used the compass as a diagnostic device only if she believed the person to be suffering from a spiritual ailment rather than a natural disease. So far, I had been unable to determine what criteria she used to differentiate between the two kinds of maladies. For her, a spiritual ailment could manifest itself in the form of a bout of bad luck, as well as a common cold, which, depending on the circumstances, might also be diagnosed as a natural ailment. Expecting to find some mechanical contraption that activated the needle, I examined the compass at every opportunity. Since there was none, I accepted her explanation as a bona fide truth. Whenever a person is centered, that is, are in harmony, the needle does not move at all. To prove her point, she placed the compass in front of herself, Candelaria, and me. To my great astonishment, the needle moved only when the compass was in front of me. Octavio Cantu craned his neck to peer at the instrument. "Am I sick?" he asked softly, gazing up at Doña Mercedes. "It's your spirit," she murmured. "Your spirit is in great turmoil." She returned the compass to the glass cabinet, then positioned herself behind the old man and rested both hands on his head. She remained that way for a long time. Then, with quick, sure movements, she ran her fingers down his shoulders and arms. Swiftly, she stepped in front of him, her hands brushing lightly down his chest, his legs, all the way to his feet. Reciting a prayer that was part church litany, part incantation, she maintained that every good healer knew that Catholicism and spiritualism complemented each other. She alternately massaged his back and chest for nearly a half hour. To give momentary relief to her tired hands, she periodically shook them vigorously behind her back. She called it casting off the accumulation of negative energy. To mark the end of the first part of her treatment, she stamped her right foot 3 times on the ground. Octavio Cantu shuddered uncontrollably. She held his head from behind, pressing her palms to his temples until he began to draw slow, difficult breaths. Mumbling a prayer, she moved to the altar, lit a candle, and then a hand-rolled cigar, which she began to smoke with even, rapid puffs. "I should be used to it by now," the old man said, breaking the smoky silence. Startled by his voice, she began to cough until tears rolled down her cheeks. I wondered whether she had accidentally inhaled the smoke. Octavio Cantu, oblivious to her coughing, continued to talk. "I've told you many, many times that whether I'm sober or drunk, I only dream one dream. I'm standing in my shack. It's empty. I feel the wind and see shadows moving everywhere. But there are no more dogs to bark at the emptiness and at the shadows. I awake with a terrible pressure. It feels like someone were sitting on my chest. As I open my eyes, I see the yellow pupils of a dog. They open wider and wider until they swallow me." His voice trailed off. Gasping for breath, he looked around the room. He no longer seemed to know where he was. Mercedes Peralta dropped the cigar stub on the floor. Grabbing his chair from behind, she swiftly turned him around so that he was now facing the altar. With slow, mesmerizing movements, she massaged him around his eyes. I must have dozed off, for I found myself alone in the room. I quickly looked around. The candle on the altar was almost burned down. Right above me, in the corner, close to the ceiling, sat a moth the size of a small bird. It had enormous black circles on its wings. They stared at me like curious eyes. A sudden rustle made me turn around. Mercedes Peralta was sitting in her chair by the altar. I muffled a scream. I could have sworn she had not been there a moment before. "I didn't know you were there," I said. "Look at that big moth above my head." I searched for the insect, but it was gone. There was something about the way she looked at me that made me shudder. "I got too tired and fell asleep," I explained. "I didn't even find out what was wrong with Octavio Cantu." "He comes to see me from time to time," she said. "He needs me as a spiritualist and a healer. I lighten the burden that weighs on his soul." She turned to the altar and lit 3 candles. In the flickering light, her eyes were the color of the moth's wings. "You'd better go to sleep," she suggested. "Remember, we're going to go for a walk at dawn." Chapter 6. Certain that I had overslept again, I dressed quickly and headed down the dark corridor. Mindful of the creaking hinges, I carefully opened the door to Mercedes Peralta's room and tiptoed toward the hammock. "Are you awake?" I whispered, pushing aside the gauzy material of the mosquito netting. "Do you still want to go for a walk?" Her eyes opened instantly, but she was not really awake yet. She continued to stare quietly ahead. "I do," she finally said hoarsely, brushing the netting aside completely. She cleared her throat, spat in the bucket on the floor, and then moved over a little to make room for me in the hammock. "I'm glad you remembered our walk," she mumbled as she crossed herself. Closing her eyes, she folded her hands and prayed to the Virgin and to a number of saints in heaven. She thanked them individually for their guidance in helping her with the people she treated, and then asked for their forgiveness. Why their forgiveness? I inquired as soon as she finished her long prayer. Look at the lines on my palms, she said, placing her upturned hands in my lap. With my index finger, I traced the clearly delineated V and M lines that seemed to have been branded. The V on her left palm and the M on her right. V stands for vida, life. M stands for muerte, death, she explained, enunciating the words with deliberate precision. I was born with the power to heal and harm. She lifted her hands from my lap and brushed the air, as though she intended to erase the words she had spoken. She stared around the room, then deliberately maneuvered her thin, fleshless legs out of the hammock and slipped into a pair of cut-out shoes through which her toes protruded. Her eyes twinkled with amusement as she straightened the black blouse and skirt which she had slept in. Holding on to my arm, she led me outside. Let me show you something before we go for our walk, she said, heading toward the working room. She turned directly to the massive altar, which was made entirely out of melted wax. It had been started with a single candle, she said, by her great-great-grandmother, who had also been a healer. Lovingly, she ran her hand over the glossy, almost transparent surface. Search for the black wax amid the multicolored streaks, she urged me. That's the evidence that witches light a black candle when they use their power to harm. Countless strands of black wax ran into the colored bands. The ones closer to the top are mine, she said. Her eyes shone with an odd fierceness as she added, a true healer is also a witch. A glimmer of a smile lingered on her lips for a moment. Then she went on to say that not only was she well known throughout the area, but that people came for her treatments from as far as Caracas, Maracaibo, Merida, and Cumana. People knew about her abroad as well. Trinidad, Cuba, Colombia, Brazil, and Haiti. There were pictures somewhere in the house attesting that among those persons had been ministers of state, ambassadors, and even a bishop. She regarded me enigmatically, then shrugged her shoulders. My luck and my strength were peerless at one time, she said. I ran out of both, and now I can only heal. Her grin widened, and her eyes took on a teasing gleam. And how is your work progressing? She asked, with the innocent curiosity of a child. Before I had a chance to take in the sudden change of topic, she added, regardless of how many healers and patients you interview, you will never learn that way. A real healer must be first a medium and a spiritualist, and then a witch. A dazzling smile lit up her face. Don't be too upset when one of these days I burn your writing pads, she said casually. You're wasting your time with all that nonsense. I became utterly alarmed. I did not take kindly to the prospect of seeing my work go up in flames. Do you know what's of real interest? She asked, and then answered her own question. The issues that go beyond the superficial aspects of healing. Things that can't be explained, but may be experienced. There have been plenty of people who have studied healers. They believe that by watching and asking questions, they may understand what mediums, witches, and healers do. Since there is no point in arguing with them, it's a lot easier to leave them alone to do whatever they want. It cannot be the same in your case, she went on. I cannot let you go to waste. So, instead of acting like you are studying healers, you're going to practice calling the spirit of my ancestor every night in the patio of this house. You can't take notes on that because the spirits count time in a different way. You'll see. To deal with the spirits is like entering inside the earth. The memory of the woman I had seen in that patio perturbed me terribly. I wanted to abandon right then all my quest and forget Florinda's plans and run away. Suddenly, Doña Mercedes laughed, a clear burst that dispelled my fears. Musuya, you should see your face, she said. You're about to faint. Among other things, you're a coward. Despite her wry, mocking tone, there was sympathy and affection in her smile. I shouldn't push you. So, I'm going to give you something you'll like. Something that has more value than your study plans. A glimpse into the life of some personages of my choice. I will make them weave tales for you. Tales about fate. Tales about luck. Tales about love. She brought her face close to mine and, in a soft whisper, added, tales about strength and tales about weakness. That will be my gift to you, to keep you appeased. She took my arm and led me outside. Let's go for our walk. Our steps rang lonely through the silent street, bordered by high concrete sidewalks. In a faint murmur, obviously wary of waking the people sleeping inside the houses we passed, Mercedes Peralta remarked that during her days as a young healer, her house, the biggest one on the street, had stood isolated at what was then considered the outskirts of town. But now, she said, the sweeping gesture of her arm encompassing everything around us, it seems I live in the center of town. We turned onto the main street and walked all the way to the plaza, where we rested on a bench, facing the statue of Bolivar on a horse. The town hall stood at one side of the plaza, the church with its bell tower at the other. Many of the original buildings had been pulled down and replaced by box-like structures. Yet the old houses that still stood, with their wrought iron grills, their red tile roofs gray with age, and their wide eaves that permitted the rainwater to splash clear of the brightly painted walls, gave the center of town its distinct colonial atmosphere. This town has not been the same since the day the clock in the tower of the city hall was fixed, she mused. She explained that a long time ago, as if resenting the advent of progress, the clock had stopped at 12 o'clock. The local pharmacist had seen to it that it was fixed, and immediately afterward, as though conjured up by an act of magic, lampposts were put on the streets and sprinklers were installed in the plaza so that the grass would stay green all year round. And before anyone knew what was happening, industrial centers mushroomed everywhere. She paused for an instant to catch her breath, then pointed to the shack-covered hills surrounding the city. And so did the squatters' shanty towns, she added. She rose and we walked to the end of the main street to where the hills began. Huts made of corrugated metal sheets, crates, and cardboard hung precariously on the steep slopes. The owners of the shacks close to the city streets had boldly tapped electricity from the lampposts. The insulated wires were crudely camouflaged with colored ribbons. We turned onto a side street, then into an alley, and finally we followed a narrow path winding up the lonely hill that had not yet been claimed by squatters. The air, still damp from the night dew, smelled of wild rosemary. We climbed almost to the top of the hill, where a solitary salmon tree grew. We sat down on the damp ground, carpeted with tiny yellow daisies. "Can you hear the sea?" Mercedes Peralta asked. The faint breeze, rustling through the trees' intricately woven crown, scattered a shower of powdery golden blossoms. They alighted on her hair and shoulders like butterflies. Her face was suffused with an immeasurable calm. Her mouth opened slightly, revealing her few teeth, yellow with tobacco and age. "Can you hear the sea?" she repeated, turning her dreamy, slightly misted eyes toward me. I told her that the sea was too far away, beyond the mountains. "I know that the sea is far away," she said softly. "But at this early hour, when the town sleeps, I always hear the sound of the waves carried by the wind." Closing her eyes, she leaned against the tree trunk as if to sleep. The morning stillness was shattered by the sound of a truck winding its way through a narrow street below. I wondered whether it was the Portuguese baker delivering his freshly baked rolls, or the police picking up last night's drunks. "See who it is," she urged me. I walked a few steps down the path and watched an old man get out from a green truck parked at the bottom of the hill. His coat hung loosely on his stooped shoulders, and a straw hat covered his head. Aware of being watched, he looked up and waved his walking stick by way of greeting. I waved in return. "It's the old man you treated last night," I told her. "How fortunate," she murmured. "Call him. Tell him to come up here. Tell him I want to see him. My gift to you begins now." I walked down to where his truck was parked and asked the old man to walk back up the hill with me. He followed me without a word. "No dogs today," he said to Mercedes Peralta, by way of greeting and sat beside her. "Let me tell you a secret, Musuya," she said, beckoning me to sit across from her. "I am a medium, a witch, and a healer. Of the three, I like the second because witches have a particular way of understanding the mysteries of fate. Why is it that some people get rich, successful, and happy, while others find only hardship and pain? Whatever decides those things is not what you call fate. It's something more mysterious than that. And only witches know about it." Her features strained for an instant with an expression I could not fathom as she turned to Octavio Cantu. "Some people say that we're born with our fate. Others claim that we make our fate with our actions. Witches say that it's neither, and that something else catches us, like the dog catcher catches a dog. The secret is to be there if we want to be caught, or to not be there if we don't want to be caught." Her glance strayed to the eastern sky, where the sun was rising over the distant mountains. After a few moments, she faced the old man once more. Her eyes seemed to absorb the sun's radiance, for they shone as if smeared with fire. "Octavio Cantu is coming to the house for his seasonal treatments," she said. "Perhaps little by little, he'll weave a tale for you. A tale about how chance joins lives together, and how that something that only witches know about fastens them into one bundle." Octavio Cantu nodded his head in agreement. A tentative smile parted his lips. The scant beard on his chin was as white as the hair sticking out from under his straw mat. Octavio Cantu came to Doña Mercedes' house 8 times. Apparently she had been treating him periodically since he was a young man. Besides being old and run down, he was an alcoholic. Doña Mercedes emphasized, however, that all his maladies were of the spirit. He needed incantations, not medicines. At first, he hardly talked to me, but then he began to open up, feeling more confident perhaps. We spent long hours talking about his life. At the beginning of each of our sessions, he invariably seemed to succumb to despair, loneliness, suspicion. He demanded to know why I was interested in his life. But he always checked himself and regained his aplomb. And for the rest of the session, whether an hour or an entire afternoon, he would talk about himself as if he were some other person. Octavio pushed the flat piece of cardboard aside and edged through the small door-like opening of the shack. There was no light inside, and the pungent smoke of the dwindling fire in the stone hearth made his eyes tear. He shut them tight and groped his way in the darkness. He tripped over some tins and banged his shin on a wooden crate. "Damn stinking place," he swore under his breath. He sat for a moment on the packed dirt floor and rubbed his leg. In the farthest corner of the wretched shack, he saw the old man asleep on a discarded, worn-out back seat of a car. Slowly, avoiding the crates, ropes, rags, and boxes scattered on the ground, he walked bent over to where the old man was lying. Octavio lit a match. In the dim light, the sleeping man looked dead. The rising and falling of his chest was so slight he hardly seemed to breathe. High cheekbones protruded from his black, emaciated face. His torn, dirty khaki pants were rolled up his calves. His long-sleeved khaki shirt was buttoned tightly around his wrinkled neck. "Victor Julio," Octavio shouted, shaking him vigorously. "Wake up, old man." Victor Julio's trembling, wrinkled eyelids opened for a moment. Only the discolored white of his eyes showed before he shut them again. "Wake up!" Octavio cried out with exasperation. He reached for the narrow-brimmed straw hat on the ground and pushed it down hard on the old man's unkempt white hair. "Who the hell are you?" Victor Julio grumbled. "What do you want?" "I'm Octavio Cantu. I've been appointed by the mayor as your helper," he explained with an air of importance. "Helper?" Unsteadily, the old man sat up. "I need no helper." He slipped into his worn-out, laceless shoes and staggered around the dark room until he found the gasoline lantern. He lit it. He rubbed the sleep out of his eyes and, blinking repeatedly, regarded the young man carefully. Octavio Cantu was of medium height, with strong muscles, visible through his unbuttoned, faded blue jacket. His pants, which seemed too large for him, bagged over his new shiny boots. Victor Julio chuckled, wondering if Octavio Cantu had stolen them. "So, you're the new man," he said in a rasping voice, trying to determine the color of Octavio's eyes, shaded by a red baseball cap. They were shifty eyes, the color of moist earth. Victor Julio decided there was something decidedly suspicious about the young man. "I've never seen you around here," he said. "Where do you come from?" "Paraguana," Octavio answered curtly. "I've been here for a while. I've seen you several times at the plaza." "Paraguana," the old man repeated dreamily. "I've seen the sand dunes of Paraguana." He shook his head and in a harsh voice demanded, "What are you doing in this godforsaken place? Don't you know that there is no future in this town? Haven't you noticed that the young people have migrated to the cities?" "It's all going to change," Octavio declared, eager to steer the conversation away from himself. "This town is going to grow. Foreigners are buying up the cacao groves and the sugarcane fields. They're going to build factories. People are going to flock to this town. People are going to get rich." Victor Julio doubled up with mocking laughter. "Factories aren't for those like us. If you stick around long enough, you'll end up like me." He put his hand on Octavio's arm. "I know why you're so far away from Paraguana. You're running away from something, aren't you?" he asked, staring hard into the young man's restless eyes. "What if I am?" Octavio shifted uncomfortably. He realized that he didn't have to tell him anything. No one knew about him in this town. Yet something in the old man's eyes unnerved him. "I had some trouble back home," he muttered evasively. Victor Julio shuffled over toward the opening of the shack, reached for his burlap sack hanging on a rusty nail, and took out a bottle of cheap rum. His hands, crisscrossed by protruding veins, shook uncontrollably as he unscrewed the lid of the bottle. He gulped repeatedly, heedless of the amber liquid trailing down his scraggly beard. "There's a lot of work to be done," Octavio said. "We better get going." "I was young like you when I was appointed by another mayor as a helper to an old man," Victor Julio reminisced. "I too was strong and eager to work. And look at me now. The rum doesn't even burn my throat any longer." Squatting on the ground, Victor Julio searched for his walking stick. This cane belonged to the old man. He gave it to me before he died. He held up the dark, highly polished stick to Octavio. "It's made of hard wood from the Amazon jungle. It will never break." Octavio glanced briefly at the cane and then asked impatiently, "Is the stuff we need here, or do we still have to get it?" The old man grinned. "The meat has been soaking since yesterday. It should be ready by now. It's outside behind the shack in a steel drum." "Are you going to show me how to fix the meat?" Octavio asked. Victor Julio laughed. All his front teeth were missing. The remaining yellow molars looked like two pillars in his cavernous mouth. "There's really nothing to show," he said in between giggles. "I just go to the pharmacist every time I want to prepare the meat. He's the one who mixes a marinade. He's the one who mixes the beef tenderizer. Actually," he explained, "it's more like a marinade." His mouth spread into a wide grin. "I always get the meat from the slaughterhouse. Compliments of the mayor." He took another gulp from the bottle. "Rum helps me to prepare myself." He rubbed his chin dry. "The dogs are going to catch up with me one of these days." He mumbled under his breath and handed the half-empty bottle to Octavio. "You better have some too." "No thanks," Octavio refused politely. "I can't drink on an empty stomach." Victor Julio opened his mouth ready to say something. Instead, he picked up his walking stick and his burlap sack and motioned Octavio to follow him outside. Absorbed, he stood for a moment and watched the sky. It was neither dark nor light, but that strange, oppressive gray that comes before dawn. In the distance, he heard the barking of a dog. "There's the meat," he said, pointing with his chin to the steel drum standing on a tree stump. He handed Octavio a bundle of ropes. "It'll be easier to carry the drum if you tie it on your back." Expertly, Octavio looped the ropes around the steel drum, lifted it on his back, then crossed the ropes over his chest and tied them securely below his navel. Is this all we need?" he asked, avoiding the old man's gaze. "I've some extra rope and a can of kerosene in my sack," Victor Julio explained, and took another gulp of rum. Absent-mindedly, he stuffed the bottle in his pocket. In a single file, they followed the dry gully that cut across the cane break. All was silent except for the fading buzz of the crickets and the gentle breeze rustling through the blade-like leaves of the cane. Victor Julio had trouble breathing. His chest hurt. He felt so tired he wanted to lie down on the hard ground. He turned often to gaze at his shack in the distance. A foreboding feeling crossed his mind. The end was near. He had known for a long time that he was too old and feeble to do all the work he was supposed to do. It would be only a matter of time before they got a new man. "Victor Julio, come on," Octavio called impatiently. "It's getting late." The town was still asleep. Only a few old women on their way to church were about. With their heads covered by dark veils, they hurried past the two men without returning their greetings. On the narrow concrete sidewalks, seeking the protection of the silent houses, scrawny, sickly-looking dogs lay curled up in front of closed doors. At Victor Julio's command, Octavio lowered the steel drum on the ground and opened the tight lid. Using the long wooden pliers he had retrieved from his burlap sack, the old man picked chunks of meat from the drum. And as he and Octavio slowly made their way through town, he fed every stray dog they came across. Hungrily, wagging their tails, the animals devoured the fatal meal. "The dogs will feed on you in hell," a fat woman shouted, before disappearing through the large wooden door of the old colonial church at the other side of the plaza. "No rabies this year," Victor Julio shouted back, wiping his nose on the sleeve of his shirt. "I think we got them all. We'll feed for the hereafter." "I think we got them all well fed for the hereafter." "I counted 17, Octavio complained, stretching his sore back. "That's a lot of dead dogs to pull." "The biggest one we won't have to carry," Victor Julio said, a sinister smile twisting his face. "There's one dog that won't die in the street." "What do you mean?" Octavio asked, turning his red baseball cap around on his head, a puzzled look on his face. Victor Julio's eyes narrowed. His pupils sparkled with an evil glint. His thin, old body shivered with anticipation. "I'm all keyed up. Now I'm going to kill the Lebanese storekeeper's black German shepherd." "You can't do that," Octavio protested. "It's not a stray dog. It's not sick. It's well fed. The mayor said only stray, sickly dogs." Victor Julio swore loudly, then looked at his helper with a wicked expression. He was certain that this was the last time he would have access to the poison. If not Octavio, then someone else would be in charge of disposing of the dogs at the end of the next dry season. He could understand why the young man didn't want to cause any trouble in town. But that was not any of his concern. He had wanted to kill the Lebanese dog ever since it had bitten him. This was his last chance. "That dog is trained to attack," Victor Julio said. "Every time it gets loose, it bites someone. It bit me some months ago." He pulled up his pant leg. "Look at the scar," he muttered angrily, rubbing the purple, knotty spot on his calf. "The Lebanese didn't even bother to take me to a doctor. For all I knew, that dog could have had rabies." "But it didn't, and you can't kill it," Octavio insisted. "The dog isn't in the street. It's got an owner." He looked imploringly at the old man. "You're only asking for trouble." "Who cares?" Victor Julio snapped belligerently. "I hate that animal, and I won't have another chance to kill it." He flung his burlap sack over his shoulder. "Come on, let's go." Unwillingly, Octavio followed the old man through a narrow side street toward the outskirts of town. They stopped in front of a large, green stucco house. "The dog must be in the back," Victor Julio said. "Let's have a look." They walked along the brick wall, encircling the backyard. There was no sign of the dog. "We better leave," Octavio whispered. "I'm sure the dog sleeps inside the house." "It'll come out," Victor Julio said, trailing his walking stick along the wall. Loud, barking splintered the morning stillness. Excitedly, the old man jumped up and down on his frail legs, brandishing his walking stick in the air above his head. "Give me the rest of the meat," he demanded. Octavio unfastened the ropes from his chest and reluctantly lowered the steel drum to the ground. The old man picked out the last pieces of meat with the wooden pliers and flung them over the wall. "Just listen to that beast, gulping down that poisoned meat," Victor Julio said gleefully. "That vicious brute is as hungry as the rest of them." "Let's get out of here fast," Octavio hissed, lifting the steel drum on his back. "There's no hurry," Victor Julio laughed. A sensation of elation evaded his body as he looked for something on which to stand. "Let's go," Octavio insisted. "We're going to get caught." "We won't," Victor Julio assured him calmly, climbing on the shaky wooden crate he had propped against the wall. He stood on his toes and looked at the raging dog. Barking furiously, the animal spat foam and blood in an effort to wrench loose whatever had stuck in its throat. Its legs grew rigid. It toppled over. Powerful spasms wheeled its body around. Victor Julio shivered. "It's even hard to die," he murmured, stepping down from the crate. He didn't feel any satisfaction in having killed the Lebanese German Shepherd. In all the years of poisoning dogs, he had always avoided seeing them die. He had never enjoyed killing the town's stray mongrels, but it was the only job that had been available to him. A vague fear filled Victor Julio's heart. He looked down the empty road. He curled his left thumb backward and placed the walking stick between it and his wrist. Holding his arm outstretched, he started to move the stick back and forth so rapidly the cane seemed to be suspended in midair. "What kind of trick is that?" Octavio asked, watching him enthralled. "It's no trick. It's an art. This is what I do best," Victor Julio explained sadly. "In the mornings and afternoons, I entertain the small children in the plaza with my dancing stick. Some of the children are friendly to me." He handed the cane to Octavio. "Try it. See if you can do it." Victor Julio laughed at Octavio's clumsy attempt to hold the stick properly. "It takes years of practice," the old man said. "You've got to develop your thumb in order to stretch it backward until it touches the wrist. And you have got to move your arm much faster so the stick won't have time to fall on the ground." Octavio handed him back the cane. "We better get those dogs," he exclaimed, surprised by the suddenness of the morning glow and the flame-colored blotches appearing on the eastern sky. "Victor Julio, wait for me," a child called after them. Barefoot, her black, tangled hair tied on top of her head, a 6-year-old girl caught up with the two men. "Look what my aunt brought me to play with," she said, holding up a German Shepherd puppy for the old man to see. "I named her Butterfly. She looks like one, doesn't she?" Victor Julio sat on the curb. The little girl sat next to him, and placed the cute, chubby puppy on his lap. Distractedly, he ran his fingers along the black and pale yellow fur. "Show Butterfly how you make your walking stick dance," the child pleaded. Victor Julio put the dog on the ground and retrieved the bottle of rum from his pocket. Without drawing a breath, he emptied its contents, then dropped the bottle into his burlap sack. There was a desolate expression in his eyes as he gazed into the child's smiling face. Soon she would grow up, he thought. She would no longer sit with him under the trees in the plaza and help him fill the trash cans with the leaves and believe they would turn to gold during the night. He wondered if she too would shout at him, taunt him, like most of the older children did. He closed his eyes tightly. "Let's see if the stick feels like dancing," he mumbled. Rubbing his creaking knees, he got up. Mesmerized, both Octavio and the child watched the stick. It seemed to be dancing by itself, animated not only by the swift, graceful movement of Victor Julio's arms, but also by the rhythmic tapping of his foot and his hoarse yet melodious voice as he sang a nursery rhyme. Octavio put the drum down and sat on it to admire the old man's skill. Victor Julio stopped his song in mid-sentence. His stick fell on the ground. With a look of surprise and horror, he saw the puppy lapping up the juice of the poisoned meat, trickling from the drum. The girl picked up the cane, caressed the finely carved head, and handed it to Victor Julio. "I've never seen you drop it," she remarked, concerned. "Did the stick get tired?" Victor Julio placed his trembling hand on her head, pulling her ponytail gently. "I'm going to take Butterfly for a walk," he said. "Go back to bed before your mother finds you out here. I'll see you later at the plaza. We'll pick leaves together." He lifted the chubby puppy in his arms and motioned Octavio to follow him up the street. The stray dogs were no longer curled up in front of closed doors, but lay rigid with their legs extended, scattered around the dusty streets, their glassy eyes staring blankly into space. One by one, Octavio tied them with the ropes Victor Julio had brought in his burlap sack. Butterfly, her whole body shaking convulsively, sent a stream of blood down the old man's pants. He shook his head with despair. "What am I going to tell the kid?" he mumbled, fastening the poisoned puppy with the others. They made 2 trips and dragged the dead dogs to the outskirts of town, past the Lebanese house, past the empty fields, down into a dried-up ravine. Victor Julio covered them with a layer of dry branches, then doused the heap with the can of kerosene he had brought with him and set them afire. The dogs burned slowly, filling the air with the smell of a scorched flesh and fur. Panting, their throats raw with smoke and dust, the 2 men climbed out of the ravine. They didn't walk far before they collapsed under the shade of a blooming red acacia tree. Victor Julio stretched out on the hard ground, still cool from the night. His hand trembled as he walked the walking stick securely over his stomach. He closed his eyes and tried to still his breathing, hoping it would dispel the pain constricting his chest. He wished he could sleep, lose himself in dreams. I've got to get going, Octavio said after a short while. I got some other jobs to do. Stay with me, the old man begged. I have to tell the kid about her dog. He sat up and gazed imploringly at Octavio. You can help me. Children so soon become afraid of me. She's one of the few who is friendly. The wretched emptiness in Victor Julio's voice frightened Octavio. He leaned against the tree trunk and closed his eyes. He couldn't bear to see the fear and the loss reflected in the old man's face. Come with me to the plaza. Let everyone know you're the new man, Victor Julio pleaded. I won't stay in this town, Octavio said gruffly. I don't like this business of killing dogs. It's not a matter of liking or disliking, Victor Julio remarked. It's a matter of fate. He smiled wistfully and let his gaze wander in the town's direction. Who knows? You might have to stay here forever, he mumbled, closing his eyes again. The silence was broken by the sound of angry voices. Down the road came a group of boys, led by the oldest son of the Lebanese. They stopped a few paces away from the two men. You killed my dog, the Lebanese boy hissed, then spat on the ground inches away from Victor Julio's feet. Propping himself on his cane, the old man rose. What makes you think it was me? He asked, trying to gain time. His hands shook uncontrollably as he searched for the bottle of rum in his sack. He stared at the empty bottle uncomprehendingly. He didn't remember having drunk the last drop. You killed the dog, the boy repeated in a chant. You killed the dog. Cursing and jabbing him, they tried to grab his stick and his burlap sack. Victor Julio backed away. Brandishing his cane, he swung it blindly at the jeering boys. Leave me alone, he screamed through trembling lips. Momentarily startled by his rage, the boys stood still. Suddenly, as if they had only just noticed that Victor Julio was not alone, they turned to Octavio. And who are you? One of the boys yelled, looking from one man to the other. Perhaps measuring the consequences of having to deal with both. Are you with the old man? Are you his helper? Octavio didn't answer, but swung the rope over his head, lashing it out in front of him like a whip. Laughing and screaming, the boys dodged the well-aimed snaps. But when several of them were stung by the rope, not only on their calves and thighs, but also on their shoulders and arms, they backed away. They ran after Victor Julio, who, in the meantime, had fled toward the ravine, where the dogs were still burning. Victor Julio turned his head. Terror dilated his pupils as he saw the boys approaching so close behind him. They no longer seemed human. They reminded him of a pack of barking dogs. He tried to run faster, but the searing pain in his chest slowed him down. The boys picked up pebbles and threw them at him, just teasing him. But when the Lebanese boy reached for a good-sized stone, the rest of the boys, eager to outdo each other, selected even larger rocks. One of them hit Victor Julio on the head. He staggered. His vision blurred. The ground under his feet gave way, and he tumbled down the precipice. The wind carried the old man's cry out of the ravine. Panting, their faces streaked with dust and sweat, the boys stood looking at each other. Then, as though someone had given a signal, they scurried in all directions. Octavio ran down the steep slope and knelt by Victor Julio's inert body. He shook him vigorously. The old man opened his eyes. His breath came in spurts. His voice was only a fainted, muffled sound. I knew that the end was near, but I thought it was only the end of my job. It never occurred to me it was going to be this way. His pupils flickered with an oddly bright gleam as he stared into his helper's eyes. Slowly, the light went out. Octavio shook him frantically. "Jesus, he's dead," he muttered, then made the sign of the cross. He raised his sweaty face toward the sky. A pale moon was clearly visible, despite the blinding brightness of the sun. He wanted to pray, but could not think of a single prayer. Only images came to his mind. A legion of dogs chasing the old man over the fields. Octavio felt his hands grow cold, and his body began to tremble. He could run away again to another town, he thought. But then they might suspect him of having killed Victor Julio. He had better stay for a while, he decided, until things cleared up. For a long time, Octavio just kept staring at the dead man. Then, on an impulse, he picked up Victor Julio's cane lying nearby. He caressed it and rubbed the finely carved head against his left cheek. He felt that it had always belonged to him. He wondered if he would ever be able to make the stick dance.